Chair Levis, I'm sorry to do this again, but I would move that we accept the finding in 101-21.
Okay, I'll second that. So we have a motion on the floor to accept the findings in one of the two exonerated cases, 101-21. Any further discussion on this case? Seeing none, Ms. Sigala, would you please call the roll?
Vice Chair Galloway?
Yes.
Member Dr. Cass?
Yes.
Member Nixon?
Yes.
Chair Levis?
Yes.
And Member Ralph?
Yes.
Motion passed 5-0.
Thank you. That leaves one case in this category remaining. Do we have any motions on case 067-21?
May I ask a question of council?
Yes, Ms. Gooch, or Vice Chair Galloway and Ms. Gooch.
Hi, Tina. So in the past, the board has made recommendations of alternate findings on cases. We have done that, and I believe that we kind of got guided back from the independent monitoring team. But if I remember correctly, that was in a case where we were hearing an appeal and came to a separate finding rather than sending that case back to the agency for review. If we have sent that case back to the agency for review and still do not agree with the findings, do we have the option as a board to sustain a policy violation based on a policy not originally in the complaint?
Chair Levis, Vice Chair Galloway, let me look really quick. I think as long as you make a specific finding as to the evidence utilized or relied upon to make that determination, that is where the issues arose with the appeal without giving the basis for the board's reasoning. Let me check. Hold on a second. And it would have to also be based on the evidence that's already in the file, not on outside independent investigations done by the board, that would not be allowable. But otherwise, it appears that that would be okay, as long as you make those specific findings in your decision.
Okay. Chair Levis, I would ask that the board sustain a policy violation of 1-1-5A1 in this case, but accept the already provided findings from the agency.
Okay, do we have so is that a motion then to?
That's a motion.
Sustain the finding and accept the other findings of exonerated and the other policy violations or accusations, complaints of violations. Do we have a second? Yes, Director Harness, sorry.
Could there be a discussion, a presentation as to the evidence that supports a sustained finding?
I think once we get in, if we get a second, then I think I have something written up that will hopefully satisfy your request.
I'll give you a second there. So we have a motion and a second on the motion to adopt the agency findings and add a finding on 1-1-5A of sustained. Any discussion, or Vice Chair Galloway, if you want to present your findings?
If you don't, yeah, if you don't mind. So this case remains troublesome to me. This month alone, we were provided 2 additional examples of APD taking into consideration the exposure of a subject's body. In one case, the subject was in clear crisis, had objects that could be used in an attempt to inflict bodily harm, and our officers could be heard discussing potential use of force events. Yet in that chaotic scenario, officers located and repeatedly encouraged the subject to clothe themselves until they did. In another case, the OBRD footage was edited to blur the top of a subject's bottom simply because their pants were slipped below their waist. However, in 06721, we see an individual who is calm and compliant for several hours before the decision was made to arrest and transport them to MDC. When that decision was made, the subject requested clothing, and as Director Harness conveyed in his memo to the board via Chair Olivas, that clothing was retrieved. When the subject requested to put that clothing on, however, they were denied that courtesy. You can see in the OBRD footage the subject being moved into the police car, still only wearing their robe that was non-functioning. There was no obvious hurry to relocate the subject to MDC as the situation had exceeded 5 hours at that point, and per the director's memo back to the board. There was no obvious concern for safety for the other individual party as they had already been transported for medical evaluation per the OBRD. There was no obvious reason for concern to officer safety as the subject was already restrained, had been for several hours, and had not demonstrated any observable combative or otherwise aggressive behavior. If a person were walking down the street in a non-functioning bathrobe with clothing or with no clothing underneath, there's a good chance that person would be cited or arrested for indecent exposure, yet that's exactly the situation that this individual was needlessly put in. Officers on scene had the clothing in their possession and could have easily assisted the subject by putting on what I believe were noted as sweatpants. IMR 13 noted the following. The board's first threshold question should be whether the investigation needs to be returned to the CPOA investigative staff for additional investigation. If the CPOA board makes findings that were not noted by CPOA or otherwise alters CPOA findings, it should do so only if the record of investigation sufficiently supports its findings and additional investigation is not warranted. I believe the board heeded the guidance of the independent monitoring team and took appropriate action last month by sending this case back for review in the context of SOP 1-1-5A1. I also believe that the board should sustain a violation of policy not based on the original complaint, given the OBRD footage that was available to us. While I do understand, to Chair Olivas' point last month, that this is a low-level policy violation and that the result of sustaining a policy violation will likely not amount to more than a conversation with a supervisor, it is exactly what I'm hoping will happen. I believe this to be a teachable moment. I would hope that it is not our intention to merely seek out policy violations where significant disciplinary action is recommended, and that we would work to highlight learning and training opportunities as well.
Thank you, Vice Chair Galloway. Do we have any discussion or questions for Vice Chair Galloway on this presentation or the motion at large? Yes, Member Nixon.
I think the presentation is very good, and I think it illustrates a real disconnect when it comes to, acting within the policy, so to speak, or something that's not in the policy, as opposed to, I guess the sanctity of life and just the decency that you would treat another human being with. So I commend you on your report on that, because I concur with that, and the fact that maybe they're right when you look at the findings and it says that it's exonerated. Maybe they are exonerated as far as, the union as well as policies that are written are concerned. But even in your description, Member Galloway, it's obvious that there's something wrong. And even when we get the briefings from the commanders and stuff like that on what's going on with uses of force or anything else, especially in the short time I've served on this board, I just don't see any difference or any headway being made at APD when it comes to how you're going to treat people in these situations, so thank you.
Any further discussion or questions on this? Seeing none, we will have a vote on this. Again, the motion is to adopt the agency findings and add this additional finding. Yes, Director Harness.
Just a point of clarification, which officers do you plan to sustain?
I think that it would be the officers, unfortunately, because we only get partial information and redacted information. It would be the officers that were on scene and at that moment when the subject was requesting their clothing.
Director Harness, do you see need for further clarification or?
Chair Levis, I guess at this point, since it's the board's decision, draft your sustained findings and then we will provide them to the department.
Okay, thank you, Director Harness. I would just say I appreciate the extra work that you've done looking at this case and this issue. I think that the problem here for me to support this is that this really is a relatively minor policy violation, and I think that we really have to focus our efforts on other issues facing the board and review of serious use of force cases. I think this is an example of the difference, as Director Harness has said before, between misconduct and I'm trying to think of the correct word, but there's a difference between misconduct and essentially mistraining or being somewhat out of compliance with sort of minor policies that I think that can be better handled at the command staff level, which I think is what you're asking for. But on principle, I just think that the board needs to not spend its time on these things, though I recognize your right to do so and fully support that right, but I can't vote yes on this. Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, Ms. Segal, if you could please call the roll.
Vice Chair Galloway?
Yes.
Member Dr. Kast?
Yes.
Member Nixon?
Yes.
Chair Levis?
No.
Member Ralph?
Yes.
That motion passed 4-1.